I'm sharing my screen now. If you can't see it, then just feel free to say something and I will try and do something. Yeah, my name's Omar Tasib. I'm from the University of York. I think, so Jenny said, I have been doing research for a long time on DLD. Actually, I only started research on DLD in 2015, so it's been about 5 years. And I come from a background of psychology, so I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, a PhD in psychology, and then I did a research position in children's mental health. And then in 2015, I started to work on a research project on developmental language disorder. And then since then, this is the kind of thing that I've been doing. So that's a bit of a background about how I came to DLD research. I'm going to give you a slight overview on what I'm going to cover during the talk today. I'm going to start off by giving you some definitions. I realize that most of the audience, well, all of the audience hopefully will be familiar with DLD. But what I have noticed in recent times or in general is that the definitions that we sometimes adopt for DLD in research studies don't always align with clinical definitions or those diagnostic criteria that are used in clinical practice. So I feel like it's important that I talk a bit about what kinds of definitions I've been working with so you get a bit of context for the findings. Then I'm going to talk about individual differences in social and emotional difficulties within populations of children and young people with DLD. A bit about environmental influences on those individual differences. And then I want to talk about genetic influences. And I think the genetic influences is particularly interesting for me because I started to work on genetic influences about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. And I feel like that's probably where I want to try and progress. I think that's probably where I can uniquely contribute to this research field. So it'd be really interesting to hear people's thoughts on what we found so far and what we think, where we think we might want to go in the future. And then I've got a take-home message for you. The approach that I've adopted is to give you a summary of the kinds of things that we're finding in my research and in the similar research. And then if there are questions about details, then we can go into those in the question and answer session. So what does DLD look like in research studies? So quite often when research studies are commissioned and carried out in the population, lots of children with and without DLD, without any neurodevelopmental conditions, for example, are recruited onto a general research project. And sometimes researchers put in a standardized measure of oral language. Sometimes it's just expressive language, sometimes it's just vocabulary, and sometimes it's really good and they put in a measure of expressive, receptive, pragmatic language and all sorts, and those are the studies that we really like. But the definition that I tend to use, and I think some similar studies used, is that if we have a measure of multiple measures of standardized oral language abilities, receptive, expressive, non-word repetition, for example, and those abilities in a given child are below what you'd expect for that particular age range, and there's no evidence of a biomedical cause such as autism or hearing loss, for example, and those language abilities or lower than average language abilities interfere with the child's ability to communicate and interact with their environment, then we usually say that that child has DLD. So that cutoff sometimes is more than one standard deviation below population mean, for example. So we take what the population looks like, we find what the mean is, and then we have a cutoff slightly below that mean. And that's how we usually identify children with DLD in research studies. I realize that's slightly different to how it happens in clinical practice. But sometimes in research studies, we have to work with what we have and get to the closest possible definition that we would have in practice. And that's usually what we use in population-based research studies of DLD. What do we mean by social and emotional difficulties? So usually when I talk about social and emotional difficulties, I'm talking about symptoms of depression and anxiety and conduct problems and hyperactivity. But those all sound very, very medicalized, disorder-based, scary things. And I think one of the things that I wanted to get across here is that some symptoms of depression, anxiety, conduct, and hyperactivity are just a normal part of being a young person, whether the young person has DLD or doesn't have DLD. So I've put a diagram here, but it's more to just get some examples of the kinds of symptoms that I'm talking about. Sometimes people feel unhappy. Sometimes people cry a lot, worry a lot, have problems sleeping, for example. People lose their temper, break things, fight a lot, steal things. And For most children, those things will happen sometimes, infrequently. It becomes a problem when it's persistent, and it starts to affect their functioning and engagement with the outside world and their environment. And that's when we start talking about a psychiatric diagnosis or a mental health condition. But to experience symptoms of these things I think it's important to not pathologize every feeling or behavior. And sometimes it's just normal to have these things, and it's a normal part of human functioning and in the population. One of the other things that I want you to continue to think about as I talk is the difference between parent and self-report. Parents are actually quite good at reporting externalizing behaviors. That's behavioral difficulties or social difficulties. So they can tell you how often their child loses their temper or breaks things or steals things or fights. And they're not so good about telling you about emotional difficulties. So when the child is feeling unhappy, for example, they might be able to give you an indication, but if you ask the child themselves, it's likely that the parent response and the child response is not necessarily the same, and it's not correlated all that well. So a lot of the research in this field now is going towards a multi-informant perspective, where you ask multiple people within the house. So you have the parent, the child, and maybe even the teacher or the sibling, for example. Why am I telling you all this? So young people with DLD tend to have more social and emotional difficulties compared to those without DLD, and there was a really nice systematic review in 2013. I've put tend in bold italics because if we took a group of children with DLD and then we took another group of children without DLD and then we compared them as a whole, you'd probably expect the children with DLD to have higher levels of social and emotional difficulties. But then if you looked at the children with DLD, there will be considerable individual differences. And what that means is just because somebody has DLD, it doesn't mean that social and emotional difficulties are inevitable. You're not destined to have social and emotional difficulties if you have DLD. They don't always go hand in hand. They do a lot of the time, but not always. So in a paper from the Manchester Language Study, which some of you might be familiar with, we found that nearly a third of children with DLD had no or very few social difficulties between the ages of 7 and 16 years. So social difficulties are definitely not inevitable for all children with DLD. A smaller proportion, but 1 in 10 children with DLD in the same sample during the same time period had no emotional difficulties. Again, that just re-emphasizes the point that social and emotional difficulties are not inevitable for children with DLD. There are lots of individual intra-group differences. One of the things that we observe in samples of children with DLD is that those children who have one type of difficulties also tend to have another type of difficulty. So if you have an emotional difficulty, you're at risk of also having a behavioral difficulty. And specifically, we tested that in one of the papers, and we found that around half of children with DLD who have one behavioral difficulty also have another behavioral difficulty. And that's reflective of what we see in the general population as well. So this is not specific to DLD. Children in the general population who have one type of difficulty, like social difficulty, they're at risk of also having an emotional difficulty. And one of the reasons that is because one explanation for mental health difficulties is that mental health difficulties are an outward manifestation, different outward manifestation of underlying distress, and they just manifest differently in different people at different stages in life. So why is there a relationship between DLD and social and emotional difficulties? So I've put lots of diagrams on the screen for you. I'll talk you through them. So we'll start with this one up here, which is DLD leads to social and emotional difficulties. So a child who has a developmental language disorder then develops social and emotional difficulties because of their developmental language disorder. And that might be for a number of reasons. So for example, it might be because DLD impairs their ability to form friendships, for example, and we know friendships are important for prevention of mental health difficulties or supporting young children when they experience mental health difficulties. Language might also be important for labeling emotions and seeking support, and having DLD might mean that you are not able to do that, and so you experience social and emotional difficulties. Or the opposite could be true. It could be that social and emotional difficulties lead to DLD. So if we think about a usage-based approach to language acquisition, where we interact with those as very young children, we interact with the people around us to acquire language. And if if a child has social and emotional difficulties, those interactions with the people around them are disrupted, and so it might be that those disruptions lead to DLD. There might be a reciprocal relationship, and what that means is DLD could lead to social and emotional difficulties, but also social and emotional difficulties could lead to DLD, and then it becomes a loop. So those are some of the explanations you've probably heard of, and you've probably thought about in your own work and in your own practice. But there's another explanation that I want to put on the table here, which is both DLD and social and emotional difficulties are caused or influenced by a separate third factor. Now, that third factor could, for example, be socioeconomic status. We know that children, DLD, the prevalence of DLD is higher in those from a low socioeconomic background, but we also know that young children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to experience social and emotional difficulties. Or that third underlying factor could also be genetics. It could be that the same genetic influences, the same genetic variants influence DLD and also social and emotional difficulties. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that a bit later on. So when I talk about the environment, what kinds of environmental influences on social and emotional difficulties in DLD samples have I looked at in my work with some of my collaborators? We've looked at two specific environmental effects. We've looked at pro-social behavior and play behavior. What is pro-social behavior? It's behavior that's intended to help others, sharing, caring. So for example, in a classroom or in a playground, you might, if somebody falls over, if a child helps, that counts as pro-social behavior. Sharing toys, sharing food, showing some empathy when someone's upset, trying to help them, caring. All those are examples of pro-social behavior. We're probably much more familiar with what we mean by play behavior, any sort of playing, group playing, team sports. It involves turn taking, cooperating with the people. In board games, for example, you might have a strategy, you might have planning to do. So those are the kinds of behaviors that we've investigated. And what we tend to find in multiple different studies is that children with DLD who have more competent play behavior, who are more competent at playing, have fewer emotional difficulties, they have fewer social difficulties. Similarly, children who are pro-social, who are helping, sharing, caring towards others, have fewer emotional difficulties, they also have fewer social difficulties. Now, if we can establish that those things are causal, it would suggest that intervening in these ways to improve play behaviors in children with DLD or pro-social behaviors in children with DLD is likely to have a knock-on positive effect on social and emotional difficulties, meaning that it will reduce their social and emotional difficulties. We're still trying to work on causal work. At the moment, we know that these things are related. Why might pro-social behavior and play behaviors be related? So one of the theories for why we engage in pro-social behavior and helping behavior is that by helping other people, it helps us feel better. So it helps to reduce our our stress and distress that we're experiencing. It might be that seeing someone else in distress, we also experience distress. So by helping them, we reduce our own distress as well as reducing their distress. Also, helping others might help to build support networks. So as a child, if I help somebody who's fallen over, if I share my toys with them, it helps to build support networks. So when I'm in need of support, then those support networks are around. Play behaviors, in play behaviors, children are able to deploy, practice, and learn lots of relationship skills, emotion regulation skills, turn taking, negotiating. All of those things are really important for behavioral and emotional regulation. Both of these types of behaviors, if we could prove causality, would be really good targets for intervention because they don't necessarily rely on oral language. So for children with DLD, being helpful, kind, and supportive towards other people, playing effectively with other people, doesn't necessarily rely on language. So it would be a really good target for intervention. Specifically play is quite intuitive for children, so the uptake would be a lot higher, I would imagine. One of the things that I deliberately missed from the previous slide was the early language and communication environment. So you've already seen this bit here. So I suggested that play and pro-social behavior are associated with social and emotional difficulties. But what influences play and pro-social behavior? Well, in the same IGLCD paper, we found that the early language and communication environment, that is what a parent does with their child in the first 2 years of life, is associated with how competent they are at social play at the age of 7 to 9 years and how pro-social they are at the age of 7 to 9 years. The better that earlier home environment, the better the child is at the play and pro-social behavior. So again, what influences that early home language and communication environment? And I asked this question because one of the things that we found in that paper, which was, I was going to say it was controversial. It wasn't controversial, but it really got me thinking, and it influenced some of the other work that I've done since, is that we found that children with DLD had a poorer early language and communication environment compared to children without DLD. Now, one of the things that could be is that one of the explanations that we gave for that in the paper was it's very difficult to promote a positive early language and communication environment if your child just won't respond or responds very little. So it's the child driving the environment it could be the child driving the environment rather than the parent driving the environment. So what else could it be? Could it be genetics? Could we look at genetic influences, and could that make a difference to children's language? We know that all behaviors and traits and abilities are partly influenced by genetics. So I've put influenced in bold italics because I think it's really important to make a distinction between genetic determinism and influence. We're not suggesting, and I don't think anybody is anymore, that any sort of psychological trait or cognitive trait or ability or behavior is determined by genetics. Determined would suggest that the environment plays no role. Influence suggests that the genetics plays a role, the environment also plays a role. And to be able to understand anything, any sort of psychological behavior, trait or ability, we need to understand the relative contributions of both genetics and the environment. But we are yet to identify any reliable genetic markers of DLD. There is no such thing as a gene for DLD. And again, the reason why markers is in bold italics is because we are no longer looking for a gene for DLD, although I think that was what people were doing in the early 2000s, maybe in the post 2010-ish. What we are now looking for is multiple genetic markers, each with a small effect size. So we're not going to find a gene for DLD because it doesn't exist. What we're likely to find is hundreds or thousands of individual small genetic variants that all contribute to the risk of DLD. But then that risk of DLD needs to interact with the environment for DLD to properly manifest. How do we know these genetic risks exist? Well, twin studies are a really good place to start. We have identical twins and we have fraternal twins. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA and fraternal twins share approximately 50% of their DNA. Now, what we find in research is that what we infer is that if identical twins are more similar to each other than fraternal twins, it suggests a genetic influence. What we can also take from twin studies is environmental influence. So we can estimate how much variance is attributable to genetic influence and how much is attributable to environmental influence. In terms of DLD, 50%, it's more than 50% heritable, meaning that 50% of the differences between people in the general population on whether they have DLD or not is attributable to genetic influences. And it says 50+% because it really depends on what your sample looks like, what kind of profile of DLD you have in there, what kind of measures you use to assess oral language, pragmatic language, and all those things. So in our recent paper, what we found was we used the twin method to try and understand whether it was the same genetic markers that influenced both DLD and social and emotional difficulties. And we did find that there were common genetic influences on both in childhood and possibly adolescence as well. So what that looks like is one of these three explanations, and I'll go through those. It could be that there's a common set of genetic variants that influence DLD, and that same set of genetic variants also influences social and emotional difficulties, but they don't interact with each other. So the reason why you see a correlation, or the reason why children with DLD also have social and emotional difficulties, according to this explanation, is because they are both influenced by the same set of genetic variants, which is why they co-occur. And once you account for genetics, there's no longer a correlation between them. The other explanation is that the other reason why common genetic effects might explain both DLD and social and emotional difficulties is because it could be that the genes that influence DLD are a set of genes, and then DLD influences social and emotional difficulties, and that's why they co-occur. And then the opposite could also be true. The genes that influence social and emotional difficulties then lead to DLD, and those are some of the explanations that I gave earlier on. But all we found in this paper was that there are common genetic influences. The same set of genes seem to influence both DLD and social and emotional difficulties. We didn't test which way, or we couldn't test which of these models is true, and we suggest that that's one of the things that future research should look at. I'm just going to take a drink of water. Okay. Another really interesting thing that we found in this paper was young people with DLD, I'll just read it out and then I'll explain it. Young people with DLD may be more susceptible to genetic influences on emotional problems compared to those without DLD. And what that means is, if you have a child with a pre-existing vulnerability for social and emotional difficulties, that pre-existing vulnerability will come to the forefront when DLD is present, because DLD acts as the stressor. So it could be that you have a child with a pre-existing vulnerability for poor mental health or social and emotional difficulties, and without DLD, they would probably be doing absolutely fine. But the presence of DLD exacerbates that genetic risk and that genetic vulnerability, and therefore social and emotional difficulties manifest. Why is that important? Because it suggests that if we can intervene early and support young children who are at risk of DLD, then what we could do is potentially stop the development of social and emotional difficulties. And I think this was probably one of the most exciting findings that we have in this particular paper, because it suggests, I think for me, it demonstrates the importance of genetic research, because it demonstrates what we need to target for the intervention. Because if we can replicate this in larger different studies and different samples, it will suggest that the intervention needs to be for language rather than social and emotional difficulties. Whereas if we'd have found a different result, it might have suggested that the intervention needs to be for social and emotional difficulties. But we need to replicate this and see what it looks like in other samples. So this is the most complicated slide, I think, of the whole talk, but it is the key message. I think a lot of the time, as researchers, we look at the relationship between social and emotional difficulties and developmental language disorder, and we see that there's a correlation, and we try and investigate that correlation, and we see what the influences are on there. Those influences sometimes look like the environment, sometimes look at the environment. So we look at the environmental influences on social and emotional difficulties. We look at the environmental influences on DLD, and then we try and understand and develop an intervention to support children in their social and emotional difficulties. But actually, that's part of a bigger picture. Genes also have an effect. Genetics also has an effect on developmental language disorder. Genetics also has an effect on social and emotional difficulties. And the genetics also interacts with the environment to influence developmental language disorder and social and emotional difficulties. So the key message from me here is we need to be looking at the bigger picture and the combined effects of both genetics and the environment, so that we can support young children with DLD in terms of their social and emotional difficulties. I have a plug about DLD papers. So if you're interested in DLD research, I've set up a Twitter bot which automatically finds papers on PubMed and posts them on Twitter. So feel free to follow that, and you'll find lots of papers like this one on DLD on there. And I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully Jenny will facilitate some questions.
Thank you